There is a particular kind of darkness that falls before a candle is lit. The moment just before the flame catches, when your eyes have adjusted to nothing, when the room holds its breath, when the whole world seems to compress itself into the quiet of wherever you are. Right now, that is where we begin. Not with noise, not with urgency, but with the long, unhurried exhale of history itself, settling around you like the smell of old paper and wood smoke. Welcome to sleep dream. Every night. This channel carries you somewhere, not forward into the restlessness of tomorrow, but backward, gently, carefully, into a world that has already finished being. A world where the outcomes are known, where the storms have passed, where the great men and women have already lived their full, complicated lives and returned to the earth. There is a deep and particular peace in history, because history cannot surprise you. It can only unfold slowly and inevitably, like a map being unrolled across a wide oak table. Tonight, we travel to the 18th century, a time when the world was lit by fire and governed by ink, when letters took weeks to cross oceans, and yet the ideas they carried could overturn empires, when science was not yet separate from philosophy, and philosophy was not yet separate from the revolution. This was the age of enlightenment, a century when reason, rather than birth or divine appointment, became the proper basis for knowledge and for governance. It spread from the coffee houses of London through the salons of Paris and crossed the Atlantic on slow, creaking ships to the American colonies, where it found soil perfectly prepared to receive it. Which brings us to Benjamin Franklin. He was born in Boston in 1706, the 15th child of a candle maker in a house that was never quiet and never quite large enough. He would die 84 years later in Philadelphia, one of the most recognized men on earth, having served as a printer, an inventor, a scientist, a postmaster, a diplomat, a spy, and a constitution maker. We will walk that life slowly, in the dark, one chapter at a time, each night carrying you a little further down the road. Tonight is only the beginning. As your breath slows and your eyes grow heavier, let the 18th century form around you. Smell the ink on the press. Feel the cold Atlantic wind. Hear the creak of a wooden sign above a shop door on a cobblestone street in a city that does not yet know what it will become. Benjamin Franklin does not yet know either. He is, for now, only a boy, and that is exactly where we will begin. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day. He was 10 years old the first time he set type by hand. Not 10 in the way a child of today might understand the word. 10 in the way the 18th century understood it, which is to say already useful, already expected to be useful, already aware that the warmth of a household depended on the labor of every person within it. Boston in 1716 was not a forgiving place for a large family with modest means. Josiah Franklin, candlemaker and soap boiler, had fathered 17 children across 2 marriages. Benjamin was the 15th. The candles his father dipped would have lit every room in a wealthy merchant's house. In Josiah's own house, they burned only as long as absolutely necessary. The city itself was not yet a century old. Boston had been founded in 1630, a Puritan settlement on a narrow peninsula. jutting into a harbor so cold and busy with tides that it had shaped the entire character of the place. There were wharves running like wooden fingers into the water, warehouses stacked with salt cod and timber, counting houses where men who smelled of sea salt argued over weights and measures with the serious, compressed energy of people who understood that commerce was survival. The streets were narrow and cobbled, and frequently smelled of horse and fire. Every household kept its buckets near the door. Benjamin Franklin was born into this world on the 17th of January, 1706, in a house on Milk Street, directly across from the Old South Meeting House. His father intended him for the church. Josiah had seen enough of the world to understand that a son with a good mind and a position in the clergy would eat more regularly than a son who did not. Benjamin was bright. Everyone who encountered him noticed it immediately. The quickness of his responses, the way his attention sharpened when an interesting problem presented itself. He attended the Boston Latin School beginning around 1714. He excelled. He was moved ahead, but Josiah Franklin had calculated the costs and found them impossible. Sustaining a son through Harvard was simply beyond what a candlemaker's income could support. At 10, Benjamin was brought into his father's shop to help with the candles and the soap. He cut wicks. He filled molds. He stirred vats of rendered fat. He was good at it, as he was good at almost everything he attempted, but the goodness brought him no satisfaction. He watched the ships in the harbor from whatever high vantage he could find. Josiah noticed the restlessness. He took Benjamin on long walks through the workshops of Boston, the coopers and the brickmakers and the braziers, watching for the moment when his son's posture changed, when the distracted alertness sharpened into something more concentrated. It sharpened at the print shop. James Franklin, Benjamin's older brother by 9 years, had returned from London with equipment and skill and the confidence of a young man who had learned something genuinely useful in one of the great cities of the world. He set up his shop on Queen Street, and in 1718, when Benjamin was 12 years old, Josiah signed the indenture that bound his youngest son to his oldest as an apprentice printer. To serve until the age of 21, the printing press was, in 1718, still one of the most consequential technologies in the world. Approximately 260 years had passed since Gutenberg assembled his first press in Mainz, and in those centuries it had remade European civilization. It had made the Protestant Reformation possible. It had accelerated the scientific revolution by allowing natural philosophers to share results and identify errors in ways that manuscript culture had never permitted. In Boston, it had a specific significance. The first press in British North America had been established in 1638 at Harvard College, one of the earliest institutions in the colonies to understand that ideas needed to circulate if a community was to sustain itself at all. Benjamin arrived at James's shop at 12 and began learning the trade from the ground up, which meant beginning with the type cases. Type was set by hand, one character at a time, from shallow wooden cases divided into small compartments. The upper case held the capital letters. The lower case held the small letters, numbers, and punctuation, a term that would pass directly into the English language as a description of uncapitalized letters. A skilled compositor could set type quickly, his fingers moving from compartment to case to composing stick in a rhythm that became over years as automatic as breathing. Benjamin was not yet skilled. He made the mistakes all apprentices made. But he learned. He also read everything he could find. Books were expensive. Libraries, in the modern sense, did not yet exist in Boston. But Benjamin was inside a printing house, and texts passed through the shop. He read whatever arrived. He read the essays of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, which appeared in the English periodicals, The Tatler and The Spectator, and which circulated through the colonies months late but with considerable influence. Addison and Steele had developed a prose style that was clear, ironic, and conversational, a style that shaped English prose for a generation. Benjamin practiced it deliberately. He would read an essay, set it aside, and attempt to reconstruct it from memory, comparing his version to the original to identify where his phrasing had gone slack. He was teaching himself to write in the only way writing can actually be taught, through sustained, critical attention to the gap between what you intend and what you have produced. He was 15 when his brother James launched the New England Courant in 1721. The existing papers were cautious and official. The Courant was different. Boston was suffering through a smallpox epidemic, and Cotton Mather had become an advocate for inoculation. James Franklin's Courant positioned itself against the campaign, running articles that questioned its safety and accused Mather of reckless experimentation. This put the paper in conflict with established authorities, and that conflict gave it readers. People who resented Mather's influence, who enjoyed seeing a powerful man subjected to public criticism. All of them found in the Courant something the other papers did not provide, the pleasure of dissent. Benjamin was in the shop for all of it. He set the type. He ran the press. He delivered the papers through the streets and watched the arguments they provoked. He was absorbing, without having words for it yet, the essential lesson that print was not a passive medium. It did things. It moved people. He wanted to write for it. He was 15, and he knew his brother would not print his work, so he did not ask. He wrote in a hand he disguised and signed his pieces with a name he invented, Silence Dogood. He slid the manuscripts under the print shop door at night, and James Franklin printed them. Silence Dogood was not merely a pseudonym. She was a character, a middle-aged widow, sharp-tongued and genuinely funny, who commented on the manners and follies of Boston society with a confidence the actual Benjamin Franklin could not have claimed in his own name. 14 of her letters appeared in the Courant between April and October of 1722. They were discussed in the streets and in the coffee houses of Boston. No one knew who wrote them. When James discovered the truth, his response was not admiration. It was anger. The relationship between the brothers had always been difficult. James was demanding and frequently harsh, and Benjamin, who had developed a formidable confidence in his own abilities, did not accept mistreatment without resistance. Tensions accumulated. The shop grew smaller dot in 1723. At the age of 17, Benjamin Franklin broke his indenture and left Boston. He arranged passage on a ship to New York, then traveled overland through New Jersey in driving rain, arriving at last at Burlington on the Delaware River, ill and exhausted. He found passage south. He arrived in Philadelphia on a Sunday morning, soaking wet, walking through streets he had never seen. eating a large roll he had bought because it was cheap and filling. Philadelphia was different from Boston. Younger, more open, founded in 1682 by William Penn on principles of religious tolerance. It had grown into the largest city in British North America, with a population of approximately 10,000 and a commercial energy that Boston, older and more settled, did not quite possess. It was also a city that rewarded competence quickly and without too much concern for where competence had come from. Franklin walked into the printing shop of Samuel Keimer, presented himself, and was put to work almost immediately. His speed at the type case set him apart. Keimer was eccentric and chaotic, but he recognized talent. The Delaware moved slowly past the docks in the early morning light. Somewhere behind him, across 100 miles of road and water, Boston was waking up without him. He did not look back. Philadelphia in 1722 was a city that rewarded patience and punished idleness in equal measure. The streets smelled of river mud and sawdust, and the particular sharpness of fresh-cut lumber, because the city was still becoming itself, still adding blocks and wharves and counting houses to its grid with the methodical confidence of a place that believed in its own future. Benjamin Franklin was 16 years old. He had been working at Samuel Keimer's printing house on Market Street for several months, and in that time he had learned two things with certainty. The first was that he was the better printer. The second was that he was not yet free. The freedom he wanted was not simply the freedom to leave an employer or change a trade. He had tasted that kind of freedom already in the crossing from Boston, in the cold morning walk up from the Market Street wharf with coins sewn into the lining of his coat, and nowhere particular to be. What he wanted now was more specific. He wanted the freedom that came from having your own voice in the world, and having the press to put that voice on paper. In Philadelphia, the container for that voice arrived in the form of a letter. His brother James, back in Boston, had been running a newspaper called the New England Courant since 1721. It was an unconventional publication, sharp-tongued and irreverent, positioned against the established order of Puritan Boston with an energy that made powerful men uncomfortable. Benjamin had contributed in small ways, setting type, running the press, absorbing the rhythms of the thing. But James had refused, consistently, and with what felt like contempt, to publish any writing Benjamin submitted under his own name. The older brother saw the younger one as a servant of the shop, not a voice in it. So Benjamin did what ambitious young men do when the direct route is blocked. He invented someone else. The character he created was named Silence Dogood, and she was, from the first line of her first letter, completely convincing. She was a widow, middle-aged, opinionated, and sharp, with a New England upbringing and a particular gift for observing the small hypocrisies of colonial life. She had opinions about the Harvard men who came back from Cambridge knowing Latin, but nothing useful. She had opinions about the way powerful men used the pulpit to maintain their comfort while dressing the arrangement up as theology. Benjamin slipped the first letter under the door of the Courant's office at night. He watched from a careful distance as his brother and the contributors read the letter aloud, argued about who had written it, praised the wit of it. James published it. Then he published the next one, and the one after that. Between April and October of 1722, 14 silenced Dogood letters appeared in the Courant, each one sharper than the last, each finding a slightly wider audience than its predecessor. They were not merely funny. They were structurally sophisticated in a way that revealed how carefully Benjamin had been reading. The influence of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, whose Spectator essays had been circulating in the colonies for nearly a decade, was evident in the framing device, the invented persona, the balance between observation and argument. But the colonial voice was entirely Franklin's own. The complaints were local, the targets were specific, and the underlying anger, barely disguised beneath the widow's pleasant tone, was the anger of someone who had been told to be quiet for too long. When James discovered who had been writing the letters, the response was not admiration. It was fury. The relationship deteriorated sharply. The shop became a harder place to exist in. The resentment thickened into something close to daily torment. Benjamin was still legally bound by his apprenticeship indenture. He could not simply walk away, but James provided an opening without meaning to. In 1722, James was arrested by the Massachusetts General Court for publishing content deemed offensive to the colonial government. During his imprisonment, the authorities required that the Courant continue publication under a different name, and that name became Benjamin Franklin's. For several weeks, 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin was, legally and publicly, the editor and publisher of a Boston newspaper. He had held the thing. He knew how it felt in his hands. When James was released, Benjamin made his plans. He voided the original indenture, and James, furious, spread word to other Boston printers that Benjamin was not to be employed. The message was effective. He left for New York first, then continued south to Philadelphia, which is where we found him already at Kiemer's Press on Market Street. In the spring of 1724, Pennsylvania's governor, Sir William Keith, took notice of the young printer. Keith was a sociable, ambitious man with a talent for making promises that felt more substantial than they were. He offered Franklin something extraordinary. He would support him in establishing his own printing house. He would provide letters of credit to take to London, where Franklin could purchase equipment and supplies. Franklin would return to Philadelphia. As an independent printer under the governor's patronage, Franklin boarded a ship in the autumn of 1724. He was 18 years old. He stood at the rail as Philadelphia's brick skyline fell away behind him, and he believed completely in the future Keith had described. He reached London in December. He went to the merchants Keith had named. There were no letters. There had never been any letters. Keith, one merchant explained with the brisk kindness of someone who had seen this before, had no credit to extend. He was a man of large promises and small accountabilities. Franklin absorbed this in a back room of a London counting house. 18 years old, with almost no money and no immediate plan. He found work within the week. The printing houses of London in 1724 were the finest in the chi and the finest. In the week. The printing houses of London in 1724 were the finest in the winter English-speaking world. And Franklin walked into them with his colonial skills and discovered something he had not expected. He was good enough. He was hired at Palmer's Printing House in Bartholomew Close, one of the most respected firms in the city. He worked there for nearly 2 years. He read everything. He argued in coffee houses with philosophers, printers, and dissenting ministers. He published a small philosophical pamphlet called A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, which he would later disavow as the overreach of a young man who had not yet learned to distrust his own cleverness. But London was teaching him something essential. The world of ideas was not separate from the world of commerce and politics. The men who shaped opinion and the men who moved money were in constant conversation across the same tables. He also, in this period, stopped drinking porter. The compositors at Palmer's, like compositors across London, had a deeply entrenched culture of ale consumption throughout the working day. Franklin declined to participate. He drank water instead, ate simply, saved money, and worked without the mid-morning dulling that the porter produced. His colleagues called him the water American. He chose to treat this as a compliment. By 1726, he was ready to go home. He sailed in July. The crossing took 11 weeks. He kept a journal, recording observations about flying fish and the phosphorescence of the water at night. He drafted, during the crossing, a personal code organized around virtues he intended to cultivate with the same methodical attention he gave to setting type. The list would be refined into 13: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, humility. He intended to track progress in a small notebook, marking failures with a black spot, aiming for the clean page. It was the most printer's approach to moral improvement ever devised. He was 20 years old, crossing an ocean, already building systems. In 1728, together with a friend named Hugh Meredith, Franklin opened his own print works on Market Street. The equipment was secondhand. The space was small. The first months were marked by the kind of financial tightness that makes a man careful about every expenditure. Franklin was careful, and he was also very good at being seen. He carried paper through the streets himself, ostentatiously, to demonstrate industry. He arrived early and left late. He made sure the right people noticed. The Pennsylvania Gazette, which he took over in 1729 after purchasing it from a struggling Keemer, became the platform he had been building toward since the silenced Dogood letters. Under Franklin's hand, it became the best newspaper in the colonies. He wrote for it, argued in it, shaped public opinion through it, and used it to establish the kind of civic standing that turned a printer into a public figure. He was 23 years old. He had escaped Boston, survived London, outlasted 3 employers, and built, from paper and type and the particular stubbornness that had always driven him, the thing he had been after. The press with his name on it, and outside on Market Street. The city moved past the window of his shop, unhurried and confident, and the Delaware caught the evening light at the end of each straight street, silver and slow, and somewhere in the press room behind him the type cases were full, and the ink was fresh, and the day's work was only just beginning. The press with his name on it was not enough. It had never been enough, and Franklin, more than most men, understood the difference between a destination and a resting place. He had arrived at the Gazette not as a man who had finished something, but as one who had cleared the first field. Behind him lay years of typesetting and apprenticeship and deliberate obscurity. Ahead of him lay everything else. He had always read too much for a tradesman. That was the plain truth of it. Books arrived in the shop as barter or by packet from London, and he read them with a deliberateness that belonged to someone building an argument, not passing an evening. Natural philosophy, mathematics, the mechanics of air and water. He kept a commonplace book, filling its pages in a hand that grew smaller and denser as the years went on, as though he were trying to hold more and more of the world within a fixed amount of space. The junto, which he had founded in 1727, was the organized expression of that habit. A dozen tradesmen and merchants gathered each Friday evening in a tavern on 2nd Street, and the questions they brought were not the ones men brought to church. Was personal liberty consistent with civil order? Could heat be measured as a substance or only as motion? Franklin presided with the same quiet authority he brought to his press room, and he learned as much from listening as from speaking. By 1730, he had taken Deborah Reed as his common-law wife, a practical arrangement formalized by the circumstances of her first husband's disappearance rather than any ceremony. She was steady and capable, running the shop while he read. Their house on Market Street became, gradually, a kind of laboratory. Instruments accumulated. A glass tube ordered from London. A simple electrostatic machine that arrived in 1745 and changed the direction of his life entirely. The electricity experiments did not begin with thunder. They began with a parlor trick. Throughout Europe, natural philosophers had been generating static electricity from glass tubes and woolen cloths, and the demonstrations had a carnival quality, sparks leaping between fingertips, small shocks that made ladies shriek and gentlemen laugh. Franklin received one of these demonstrations secondhand, through a letter from a London acquaintance describing the work of a Dutch scientist, and where other men saw a spectacle, he saw a question. The sparks were consistent. They obeyed something. What was it they obeyed? He began with what he had. The glass tube, a sheet of tinfoil cut into strips. He observed that the charge accumulated on surfaces moved between conductors and could be stored, the last discovery refined by Dutch scientists into a device called the Leyden jar, a small glass vessel lined with foil that could hold a charge and release it in a single powerful shock. Franklin obtained one and spent weeks probing its behavior, filling pages with observations in his cramped, slanting script. What he discovered, and what no one before him had properly articulated, was that electricity was not two separate substances, a positive fire and a negative, but a single fluid that moved from areas of excess to areas of deficiency. He named these conditions plus and minus, and the terms have not been replaced in nearly 3 centuries. The insight sounds simple now because it became the foundation of everything that followed. In 1747, it was a conceptual leap that required both mathematical intuition and a willingness to discard the framework. Everyone else was using dot. He also discovered the principle of conservation of charge. When electricity passed from one body to another, the total quantity remained the same. Nothing was created or destroyed. It was transferred. This, too, sounds obvious in retrospect, and in retrospect is where all great ideas are eventually placed. Once the difficulty of reaching them from the front has been forgotten, his letters to Peter Collinson, a Quaker merchant and fellow of the Royal Society in London, were read before that body in 1747 and 48, and they caused a sensation. The Royal Society was confronted with a series of letters from a colonial printer that reorganized the entire Conceptual Framework of Electrical Theory. Collinson arranged for the letters to be published as a pamphlet. By 1751, experiments and observations on electricity had been translated into French, German, and Italian, but the theory of electrical fluid, however elegant, was not the thing that would make his name permanent. That was the lightning. The connection between lightning and electricity was suspected before Franklin pursued it, the way most large ideas are suspected before someone actually does the work of proving them. The sparks from his Leyden jar looked like small lightning. The smell after a discharge was the same sharp metallic smell that lingered after a summer storm. He noted these resemblances in his letters with characteristic precision, listing 12 specific similarities between laboratory sparks and natural lightning, including color, crooked direction, swiftness, the destruction of animals, melting of metals, firing of inflammable substances, and the direction of flow along conductor's dot in 1750. He proposed an experiment. A long iron rod elevated above a building could draw electrical fire from an approaching cloud. If the rod was grounded by a wire running into the earth, the charge would dissipate harmlessly. If not grounded, the rod would carry enough charge to confirm whether clouds were electrically active. He described this in a letter to Collinson and thought little more of it. He was busy. The Gazette required attention. He was serving as clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly and managing the post office for Philadelphia. The French moved first. King Louis XV, having read a translation of Franklin's letters, ordered his natural philosophers to attempt the experiment. In May of 1752, a 40-foot iron rod was erected at Marly-la-Ville, north of Paris, and a French soldier named Coiffier stood watch through a storm. The rod drew a charge. A spark jumped. The news was sent to Paris and then to London and within weeks to Philadelphia. Where Franklin read of his own experiment success in a foreign country before he had attempted it himself, he had, by then, conceived of a simpler version. A kite. The details of the kite experiment, June of 1752, a thunderstorm building over Philadelphia, a hemp string with a metal key tied near the bottom, a silk ribbon separating his hand from the hemp, are among the most retold in the history of science, which means they have also been among the most embellished. Franklin did not stand in an open field during a lightning strike and survive by luck. He flew the kite from a shed, keeping the silk ribbon dry, and waited for an electrified cloud to pass overhead. Not a direct strike, but the ambient charge of a thunderstorm, enough to stand the hemp fibers upright and produce a spark at the key. When his knuckle approached it, he repeated the experiment several times. He noted in his account, published that October in the Pennsylvania Gazette, that the discovery confirmed what his experiments had predicted, though he described it with the practiced restraint of a man who knew that understatement carried more authority than excitement. The lightning rod followed almost as an afterthought. If clouds were electrical, and if a grounded rod would draw their charge harmlessly into the earth, then buildings and ships could be protected from the fires and explosions that lightning caused every year. He published the design in Poor Richard's Almanac and gave it away. He held no patent. He charged no licensing fee. The rod spread across Pennsylvania within a decade and across the Atlantic shortly after, and wherever it appeared, it did exactly what he had said. It would do. His election to the Royal Society of London came in 1756, the only exception ever made to the Society's requirement of a formal nomination process. They elected him without one, which was their way of saying that the usual procedures had not been designed with someone like him in mind. He was 46, years old by the time the lightning rod had become a common fixture on Philadelphia rooftops. He had trained himself without any formal institution, without a single university course, without a mentor beyond the books he had carried into print shops since the age of 12. The men who awarded him the Copley Medal, the highest honor the Royal Society could give, did so in 1753, acknowledging that he had done what scientists with access to every laboratory in Europe had not. He had looked at lightning and asked a plain question, and then he had answered it. The press on Market Street still ran. Deborah managed it capably. But Franklin himself had moved quietly into a different kind of work. The Colonial Post Office would come next. Then the Assembly would send him to London. Then a larger storm than any he had flown a kite into would begin to gather over the Atlantic, and he would find that the skills he had built in the study of electricity, the patience to observe, the willingness to wait, the understanding that invisible forces could be redirected if you knew where to put the rod, translated, with some adjustment, into the study of empires. He folded the last of his notes into a journal. Outside, the Delaware moved past the end of Market Street, broad and unhurried, catching the last of the evening light. The smell of a recent storm still hung in the air. That same sharp smell he had first noted 7 years before, the smell of something transferred, something equalized, the smell of a charge that had found its proper ground. The Colonial Post roads ran like veins through a body that did not yet know it was alive. Rutted tracks through pine forest, muddy crossings at river fords, relay stations where a rider could change horses and hand off a leather bag without dismounting. The system was old, slow, and thoroughly corrupt. Postmasters pocketed revenue. Riders sold information on the side. Newspapers paid bribes to ensure their issues moved ahead of competitors. It was, in other words, a system perfectly suited to a man who had spent 30 years learning how information moved, where it pooled, and where it died. Benjamin Franklin was appointed Joint Deputy Postmaster General for the American colonies in the summer of 1753. He was 47 years old. The appointment was, on its face, an administrative post. A salary, a title, a set of ledgers to review. No one who gave it to him expected much. They had misread the man, as people consistently did when they looked at the round face, the easy smile, the plain coat, and concluded they were seeing someone simple. He began by traveling. 2 inspection tours, covering more than 1,700 miles of colonial road, in a carriage fitted with a wheel-measuring device of his own design, a small odometer that counted rotations and translated them into distances. By the time he returned to Philadelphia, he knew the post roads better than any man alive. He knew where the bridges were sound and where the planking had rotted through. He knew the exact distances between relay stations, the hours lost at each crossing, the seasonal variations that turned Virginia clay roads into impassable mud for 6 weeks every spring. The reforms were systematic and unglamorous. Shorter routes, night riders on the trunk roads, so that a letter posted in Philadelphia could reach New York in 33 hours rather than 6 days. Mandatory accounts from every postmaster reviewed quarterly. The men who had been stealing quietly for years found, with some surprise, that the new system made stealing difficult. Revenue to the crown nearly tripled in the first decade of his tenure. But there was another consequence, less visible in the ledgers and more consequential in the long run. A faster postal system meant a faster circulation of newspapers, and in the colonies of the 1750s, newspapers were not merely sources of entertainment. They were the primary medium through which political argument traveled. A pamphlet printed in Boston could reach Charleston in 2 weeks. The colonies, which had grown up as separate and often mutually suspicious entities, began to develop something like a common conversation. Franklin did not cause this, but he built the pipe through which it flowed. He was in Philadelphia in 1757 when the Pennsylvania Assembly sent him to London. The specific mission was narrow, a dispute with the Penn family over whether their lands could be taxed to fund the colony's defense. Franklin was chosen as the man most likely to navigate London's political world without either a humiliating capitulation or an open rupture. He arrived in July and took rooms in Craven Street, near the Strand, in the house of a widow named Margaret Stevenson. He would live there off and on for the better part of 18 years. He set up his instruments in the back rooms, maintained his electrical experiments, and embedded himself in the intellectual life of a city that was, in the mid-18th century, arguably the richest concentration of human knowledge in the Western world. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society. He received honorary degrees from Oxford and Edinburgh. He dined with William Pitt. He corresponded with David Hume. And in between the dinners and the lectures, he worked the Penn case with a thoroughness that exhausted his opponents. The settlement, reached in 1760, was imperfect but functional. Franklin returned to Philadelphia briefly, then went back to London in 1764. He would not see American soil again for 11 years. The issue that kept him there was growing beyond any single colony's grievance. The 7 Years' War had ended, leaving Britain with a vastly expanded empire and an enormous debt. Parliament's response was direct. The colonies would help pay for their own defense. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposed a tax on every legal document, every newspaper, every pamphlet sold in the American colonies. Franklin misread the colonial response. He had been in London long enough that he initially thought the act might be accepted with grumbling and then simply lived with. The letters that arrived from Deborah in the autumn of 1765 corrected him sharply. Mobs had gathered in Philadelphia. His friend had resigned the stamp post under threat. There were men in the streets who talked about burning Franklin's house. Deborah had armed herself and barricaded the doors. He understood, reading those letters across the Atlantic, that something had shifted in the colonies that could not be. Negotiated back into place, he appeared before the House of Commons in February of 1766 to testify against the Stamp Act. The examination lasted most of a day, 174 questions, and Franklin answered each in a flat and unhurried voice, with the precision of a man who had spent his adult life reducing complex problems to their simplest terms. He made the constitutional argument in terms a merchant could understand and the practical argument in terms a politician could not ignore. The Stamp Act was repealed the following month. He was celebrated in London. He was celebrated in the colonies. Wedgwood produced a medallion with his profile. He was, for a moment, the most popular man in the empire. The moment did not last. Parliament passed the Declaratory Act alongside the repeal, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Franklin understood it differently from most. He had read enough history to know that powers formally asserted tend eventually to be exercised. The decade that followed proved him correct with a thoroughness that gave him no satisfaction. The Townshend Acts came in 1767. The Boston Massacre came in 1770. The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And through all of it, Franklin remained in London, still writing, still meeting with ministers, still believing, longer than the evidence warranted, that some reasonable settlement was available. The episode that ended his London career arrived in the form of a packet of letters. In 1772, Franklin obtained private correspondence written by Thomas Hutchinson, then Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, advising the British government that colonial liberties would need to be curtailed if order were to be maintained. Franklin sent the letters to the Massachusetts Assembly, believing that if colonial leaders understood the source of the policies they resented, the anger might be redirected and some reconciliation remain possible. The Assembly published the letters. The scandal engulfed London. Franklin was summoned before the Privy Council in January of 1774 in a room called the Cockpit before an audience that had come to watch his entertainment. The Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, delivered an address lasting nearly an hour, accusing Franklin of theft and dishonor. Franklin stood silent throughout, in his blue velvet coat, his face giving nothing away. Those who watched him said afterward that he looked like a man listening to a description of someone else entirely. He was dismissed from the post of Deputy Postmaster General the following day, the position he had held for 21 years, the one that had transformed the colonial mail system and built the circulatory network through which a revolution would eventually pump its arguments, was taken from him with a letter and no ceremony. He remained in London one more year, making his last attempts at negotiation. There was nothing left to find. In March of 1775, at the age of 69, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship at Portsmouth and sailed west. He carried his instruments, his papers, his correspondence with half the scientists in Europe, and a very clear understanding of what he was returning to. The war had already begun by the time he landed. Lexington and Concord were 3 weeks behind him. He stepped off the ship in Philadelphia on the 5th of May, 1775, and was met by a delegation asking him to serve in the Second Continental Congress. He accepted before he had unpacked his trunks. The Delaware moved past the end of Market Street, broad and indifferent to the arguments of men. But the arguments were coming now regardless, and the old printer who had once studied the motion of electricity through a kite string had spent 2 decades learning something more intricate than lightning, the precise angle at which the weight of an empire, applied at the wrong point, will cause it to break. The ship that carried Benjamin Franklin to France was small, leaky, and accompanied by a continental frigate that fired its guns at anything English it encountered on the open Atlantic. Franklin was 70 years old. He had gout in both feet and a skin condition that had troubled him for years, and he had brought with him 2 grandsons, William Temple, his illegitimate grandson and the son of the Loyalist governor he had disowned, and Batch, who was 7. He sat Belaudix in the cold and measured the temperature of the Gulf Stream with a thermometer he had packed himself, recording observations in a notebook while the frigate exchanged cannon fire somewhere above him. It was the kind of thing he did. They landed at Orsi in Brittany on the 3rd of December, 1776. The roads from the coast to Paris were frozen and rutted. Franklin rode in a carriage for 9 days with his feet wrapped in flannel, passing through towns where people came out to look at him. By the time the carriage reached Paris, word had traveled ahead. The American philosopher, the man who had captured lightning. When he appeared in a crowd without a wig, in plain dark wool, with the fur cap he had bought against the cold, the Parisians decided it was a statement, and they were not wrong. Though the statement was partly accidental, he established himself at Passy, a quiet suburb west of Paris on a bend of the Seine, in the Hôtel de Valentinois, a large estate lent to him by Jacques Donatien Le Ray de Chaumont, a wealthy merchant who had been supplying the American cause with money and equipment on credit. The house had a garden and a view of the river, and Franklin set up a small printing press in a cottage on the grounds, which he used to print official letters, formal passes, and occasionally short essays for his own amusement. He was 70 years old and living in a foreign country at the center of a war, and he found time to be charming. The French government's position was one of careful, deliberate ambiguity. Foreign Minister Virgins had been moving toward supporting the American rebellion since before the Declaration was signed, not from any sympathy with Republican ideals, but from cold calculation. France had lost Canada and most of its North American territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War. A successful American revolt would weaken Britain and divide its resources. Vergennes wanted this. What he feared was acting too early and finding himself at war before the moment was right. Franklin understood all of this. He did not press Vergennes. He waited. He appeared at salons and at the Académie des Sciences, where he was received with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. He played chess in the evenings with the Comtesse de Polignac and with Madame Brillian, a young married woman who had become deeply fond of him and called him Papa. He sat for portraits. Turgot, the former finance minister, composed a Latin epigram. He tore lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants. Franklin smiled when it was repeated to him. The secret aid had already begun before Franklin arrived. In May of 1776, Vergennes had arranged for a fictitious trading company, Rodrigue Hortalez et Company, to be created for funneling arms to the Americans without direct French fingerprints. The man chosen to run it was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the playwright who would later write The Barber of Seville. Beaumarchais procured muskets, cannon, clothing, and gunpowder, shipping them across the Atlantic aboard vessels whose manifests listed commercial cargo. The first major shipment arrived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in April of 1777, and a substantial portion of the materiel that allowed the Continental Army to survive that year came through this. Channing. Franklin worked alongside this operation rather than through it, his role being to make France commit openly. This required Washington to win something. The news from America was not encouraging. The British had taken New York, and Washington's army had retreated across New Jersey in conditions that a British officer described as desperate. The French court was watching actual battles. Then Saratoga. In October of 1777, General Burgoyne surrendered an entire British army of roughly 5,000 men to General Gates in upstate New York. It was the largest British military capitulation since the beginning of the war, and when the news reached Paris on the 3rd of December, exactly 1 year after Franklin had landed in Brittany, Vergennes moved. He summoned Franklin and told him France was prepared to recognize American independence and enter into a formal alliance. The negotiations were conducted quickly. Franklin worked alongside Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, though his relationship with Lee was strained almost to open rupture. Lee suspected everyone and wrote letters to Congress accusing Deane of financial corruption, accusations that were partly generated by British intelligence agents who had penetrated the American mission. The penetration was significant. The British Secret Service in Paris was run by Paul Wentworth, a loyalist who had built a network of paid informants throughout the French capital. His most important asset was Edward Bancroft, a Massachusetts-born physician whom Franklin had known for years and personally recommended as secretary to the American Commission. Bancroft was simultaneously a British spy. He supplied London with weekly dispatches hidden in a bottle placed in a hollow tree near the Tuileries Garden on Tuesday evenings. Bancroft's access was extraordinary. He sat in on meetings. He knew American negotiating positions almost as they were being formed. Franklin never discovered it. The espionage was not confirmed from British records until 1789, and the full documentation was not published until the 20th century. Franklin operated in this environment with a combination of genuine openness and calculated display. He once remarked that since he assumed his letters were being read, he tried to write them so that anything a foreign government might see would do no harm. This was a theory of counterintelligence that relied on flooding the information environment with benign content, while sensitive work was done in private meetings. The alliance proceeded despite the penetration. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance were signed on the 6th of February, 1778, in Paris. France formally recognized the United States of America, the first European power to do so. The alliance committed France to enter the war against Britain, which it did that summer. Spain followed the following year. The war that had begun as a colonial rebellion was becoming a world conflict, and Franklin's patient chess game in the salons of Paris had played a role in making it. So he remained at Passy. He continued to receive visitors, to write letters, to print his bagatelles, to play chess late into the evenings. Voltaire, dying and returned to Paris for the first time in decades, met him at the Académie des Sciences and embraced him. It was the spring of 1778. Two old men, each famous for the same approximate thing, standing in a lit room while a crowd watched them touch each other's shoulders and smile. The crowd, predictably, wept. From 1778 onward, Franklin was the sole official American minister to France. He negotiated loans. He managed the accounts of American naval captains who stopped at French ports. John Paul Jones came to him to complain about equipment and provisions, and Franklin assisted him with a patience that Jones did not always reciprocate. The work was detailed, exhausting, and often unglamorous, and he did it in a house in a garden above the Seine. In the fur cap that French engravers had made famous across 2 continents. With a printing press in the cottage behind him, and a chessboard that rarely sat empty for long. By the spring of 1778, Benjamin Franklin had been in France for more than a year, and Paris had long since decided what it thought of him. The image was fixed: the fur cap, the plain coat, the spectacles perched low on a broad nose, the unhurried manner of a man who had somewhere private to be. Printmakers sold his likeness on snuff-boxes, medallions, porcelain cups. Voltaire had embraced him publicly at the Académie des Sciences. The philosopher-scientist from the New World fit precisely into the story. France wished to tell itself about reason triumphing over old aristocratic darkness. Franklin understood this perfectly, and he used it without embarrassment. The alliance of February 1778 had given the American cause something it could not have manufactured alone: a great power's navy, a great power's treasury, and, most crucially, a great power's willingness to keep British attention divided across 2 oceans. The French had signed not because they loved republicanism. They signed because they hated Britain, because virgins had counseled patience through years of calculation, and because the American victory at Saratoga in October 1777 had finally demonstrated that this rebellion had weight. It could win, and France intended to be positioned on the winning side when the accounting came. Spain entered the war in 1779. The Dutch Republic followed in 1780. Britain, which had once commanded European seas with reasonable confidence, now found itself fighting on multiple fronts from Gibraltar to the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent. The strategic pressure was immense. Lord North's ministry strained under it. The king's resolve began to encounter the particular fatigue that comes from watching a war become expensive without becoming brief. Franklin watched all of this from Passy in the house beside the Seine, and he was not idle. The correspondence alone would have broken a younger man. Letters arrived in bundles from American captains seeking provisions, from Congress seeking money, from merchants seeking permission, from spies seeking legitimacy. He answered them with patience, dispatching each in clear, unornamented prose that conveyed authority without theatrics. He negotiated loans from the French treasury in 1778 and 1779 and 1780, each one harder to obtain than the last because French finances were themselves under strain. Necker, the finance minister, was performing his own arithmetic, and the numbers did not improve with generosity. There were difficulties with colleagues. Arthur Lee, one of the other American commissioners, despised Franklin with the intensity of a man who believed himself underappreciated. Lee wrote accusations back to Congress suggesting corruption and mismanagement. Silas Deane, the third commissioner, was recalled amid controversy. Franklin remained. Congress voted in September 1778 to consolidate the mission under a single minister plenipotentiary, and Franklin was the choice. The war continued to turn, slowly, in directions that neither side could fully read at the time. Cornwallis moved through the southern colonies with confidence in 1780, and then with less confidence in 1781. Washington and Rochambeau marched south in the late summer of 1781. De Grasse's fleet held the Chesapeake. The British Relief Squadron fought the Battle of the Virginia Capes on the 5th of September, 1781, and withdrew. Cornwallis, besieged at Yorktown, surrendered on the 19th of October to an army of American and French soldiers who stood in two long lines while his troops marched out and laid down their arms. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down." Lord North received the news in London and said, reportedly, "Oh God, it is all over." The ministry fell in March 1782. The Rockingham Whigs came in, succeeded quickly by Shelburne, and the new government opened discreet back channels toward peace. Richard Oswald, a Scottish merchant with long experience in Atlantic trade, arrived in Paris in April 1782, carrying a commission to speak informally with Franklin. He was plain-spoken, shrewd, inclined toward pragmatism over ceremony. Franklin liked him immediately. What followed over the next months was a negotiation of extraordinary complexity conducted by men who were, each for his own reasons, determined to keep it moving. Franklin at 76 was the senior figure on the American side, though he was soon joined by John Adams, who arrived from the Netherlands in October 1782, and John Jay, who came from Madrid. Jay was suspicious. Adams was combative. Franklin was neither, which sometimes frustrated his colleagues and sometimes proved essential. He understood that the British needed the treaty as much as the Americans did, and that understanding gave him patience. The American commissioners had instructions from Congress to proceed in full consultation with Vergennes and the French ministry. Jay and Adams thought this a mistake. They believed with some justification that French and American interests were not identical, and that Vergennes might be willing to accept a peace that left the Americans with less than they could otherwise obtain. Franklin was more cautious about circumventing French wishes, not from naivety, but from the knowledge that without French money and French ships, the war might not have ended when it did. He was also aware that Vergennes was aware of what Jay and Adams were doing, and chose not to make a diplomatic incident of it, which itself told a story. The negotiations turned on territory above almost everything else. The Americans wanted the lands east of the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes south to Florida. The British were reluctant to concede so much. Oswald reported back to Shelburne, who reported to Cabinet, where the argument went back and forth through the summer and autumn months. Franklin, at various points, raised the possibility of Britain ceding Canada altogether as a gesture toward permanent peace. The British were not prepared for that, but they were prepared, eventually, for a great deal. The provisional articles were signed on the 30th of November 1782 at the Hotel de York, on the Rue Jacob, in a room that was by most accounts unremarkable. A table, chairs, candles, a fire against the November cold. Franklin signed. Adams signed. Jay signed. Lawrence signed. Henry Lawrence, who had been captured at sea in 1780 and held in the Tower of London for more than a year, released only in time to attend the final sessions. Oswald signed for Britain. The terms were better than most had expected. Britain recognized the independence of the 13 states absolutely and without qualification. The boundaries ran from the Atlantic west to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes south to the 31st parallel. American fishermen retained rights in the waters off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, a provision Franklin had argued for with particular tenacity, because he knew what the New England fishing trade meant in human terms. In livelihoods, and the small economies of coastal towns that had been sending boats north for generations. Congress was to recommend to the states that Loyalist property be restored, a provision that sounded more substantial than it proved in practice, since Congress had no power to compel the states to do anything of the sort, and most states declined to trouble themselves. Vergennes, when he saw the terms, was displeased that he had not been consulted before signature, and told Franklin so in a letter that was measured in its language and unmistakable in its import. Franklin's reply was a piece of diplomatic writing that is still studied. He acknowledged the breach of their instructions, expressed regret for any offense given, reminded Vergennes of what America owed France, and then gently observed that news of the preliminary articles, if it reached Britain in advance of a complete peace, might give British hardliners reason to restart the war rather than conclude it. It would not, he implied, serve French interests to have that happen. Vergennes read it and did not press the matter. He continued the French loans. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on the 3rd of September 1783 at the same Hôtel de York, in the same city that had given Franklin his fur-capped image and his snuff-box portrait and his place among the philosophes. Britain signed simultaneously with France and Spain. The war was over. The United States of America had its independence recognized by the nation, whose army had spent 8 years attempting to prevent exactly that. Recognition that Franklin wrote to a friend that he was glad he had lived to see it. He was 77 years old. His gout was severe. His kidneys were failing him. He would not see 80. He had sat at that table in November as the older of the two parties, older than Oswald, older than the war, older in many ways than the country whose interests he had spent years defending at a distance of 3,000 miles. He had done it in a garden above a river, with a chessboard and a printing press and the slow accumulation of patience that is required when you are asking the world to accept something it has not yet decided it wants. Outside the Hôtel de York, Paris continued in its ordinary autumn way. Carriages moved along the Rue Jacob. Somewhere near the Seine, leaves were falling into the water and being carried downstream toward the sea. The treaty existed now in ink and wax and the formal signatures of men who would mostly not live to see what it had set in motion. Franklin folded his copy carefully, as a printer folds a page he intends to keep. He came home in September of 1784, after 9 years abroad. The ship entered Philadelphia harbor on a Saturday morning, and the wharves were crowded. Cannons fired. Bells rang from the steeple of Christ Church, and people pressed forward along the waterfront to catch a glimpse of the old man being helped down the gangplank. He was 78 years old. His legs could not carry him well. 2 men steadied him on either side, and he moved slowly, with the particular carefulness of someone who has learned that the body no longer forgives haste. He had been away so long that the city had changed around the outline of the man they remembered. New buildings stood where he had known open lots. Streets he had helped survey were now paved and named. The Pennsylvania State House, which he had walked past countless times as a young alderman, had been the site of a declaration he helped write, but could not witness being ratified, because he had been in France. He carried all of this with him as the carriage moved through the streets toward Market Street. Toward the house he had expanded in letters and in imagination over the decades of his absence. His daughter, Sally, had managed the household through the years. His grandchildren, William Temple Franklin and Benjamin Franklin Bache, had grown into young men under his influence, one having served as his secretary in Paris, the other being trained in the printing trade, which Franklin considered the only honest beginning for any ambitious young American. The house on Market Street had been enlarged at his instruction, a large dining room added, so that he could receive visitors without exhaustion. He expected visitors. He was never wrong about that. The kidney stones had worsened on the voyage. He had tried not to show it. In correspondence he had mentioned them obliquely, the way men of his generation referred to serious suffering, as though it were a minor inconvenience that a person of good sense would manage without complaint. In private, the pain was considerable. He wrote to a French friend that he had found a position in which the stones troubled him less, lying half reclined on his left side, and that he had taken to conducting all his correspondence from that position. His letters from this period are among the most remarkable ever written, because they betray almost nothing of the physical condition in which they were composed. He was elected President of Pennsylvania in October of 1785. The title was something between a governorship and a ceremonial honor, and he accepted it with a practical man's understanding that influence rarely announces itself directly. He served 3 one-year terms. He attended sessions when his health permitted, which was not always. He continued to write. He corresponded with scientists in France and England, with former adversaries in London, with old friends in Boston who were growing as ancient as himself. He maintained a vast network of correspondence that functioned like a second nervous system, carrying information and influence across an ocean in both directions. The summer of 1787 was extraordinary, and he knew it while it was happening, which is rarer than it sounds. 55 delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia at the State House to revise the Articles of Confederation. Franklin was the oldest man in the room by a considerable distance. He was 81. George Washington, who presided, was 55. James Madison, who would do more of the shaping than anyone, was 36. Alexander Hamilton was 32. Franklin sat among them as a kind of living historical monument, a man who had signed the Declaration of Independence, negotiated the alliance with France, and written the Treaty of Paris, and who was now watching a third generation of American founders attempt to build something durable out of the arguments of the previous 11 years. He could not stand to speak for long. On days when he had prepared remarks, a colleague named James Wilson would read them aloud on his behalf. Franklin sat and listened and occasionally passed notes. His interventions were infrequent, but timed, with the precision of a man who had spent 80 years learning when to speak and when to allow silence to do the work. In June, when the convention was deadlocked between large states and small states over the question of representation, Franklin proposed what would later be called the Great Compromise. He suggested that Congress be divided into 2 chambers, one proportional by population and one equal by state. He did not claim credit for the entire idea. He rarely claimed credit for anything that required other men to agree with it. On the final day of the convention, in September, when delegates were signing the finished document, Franklin looked at the chair in which Washington had sat throughout the proceedings. The chair had a carved sun on its back, a half circle of rays spreading upward from the horizon. Franklin told the men around him that throughout the summer he had been unable to determine whether the sun was rising or setting. Now, he said, he was certain it was rising. It is the kind of remark that sounds invented afterward, but Madison recorded it in his notes the same day it was said, and Madison was not a man who embellished. Franklin signed the Constitution on the 17th of September, 1787. It was the third founding document he had signed, after the Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Paris. No other person in American history has signed all three. He did not remark on this distinction. It was not the kind of thing he remarked on. His last years at Market Street were spent in a shrinking radius. He received visitors when he could. He worked on his autobiography, which he had begun decades earlier in England, and which he now continued in slow installments, writing from memory about a life so long and varied that the early chapters read like fiction. He never finished it. The manuscript ends in the 1770s, leaving the French years and the Constitutional Convention unwritten, leaving the reader at a permanent threshold, as though the author had simply stepped into another room. He wrote one last public letter in February of 1790, a petition to Congress urging the abolition of slavery. He had owned enslaved people himself, 2 of them, in the years before his conversion to the abolitionist cause. He had freed them. He had become president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1785. The petition was tabled by Congress. Franklin was 84 and dying. He did not have the strength to press the matter further. He took to his bed in April. The pain from the kidney stones had become unmanageable. Pleurisy had settled in his lungs. He stopped eating. His daughter Sally sat with him through the final days, and his grandson Benjamin Franklin Batch was nearby. On the night of April 17th, 1790, he shifted in his bed, turned onto his side, and stopped breathing. He was 84 years old. 20,000 people attended his funeral in Philadelphia. It was the largest public gathering the city had ever seen. Messages of condolence came from governments across Europe. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning. Jefferson, who was in New York, wrote that the world had lost one of its greatest men. Washington, characteristically, said less, but he wore mourning clothes for a month. What Franklin left behind was not a single legacy, but a series of them, layered over one another like geological strata. He left the lightning rod and bifocal lenses and the flexible urinary catheter. He left the first American lending library and the first American fire company and the first American learned society. He left a postal system and a university and a newspaper that survived him by decades. He left a style of writing so clear and economical that it became the standard against which American prose would measure itself for generations. He left the alliance with France without which the revolution might have failed. He left a signature on a constitution that outlasted every government in the world that existed at the time he signed it. He also left the autobiography unfinished, ending in a decade he had long since passed through. Scholars would spend the next 2 centuries arguing about what he left out and why, and what the omissions reveal. He had been a printer, and printers understand that every page has limits, and that what you choose to include is never separable from what you choose to leave behind. The candle on his desk had burned down to its base. The quill lay across the open page where it had been set down, not carelessly, but with the deliberateness of someone who expects to return. The papers rustled faintly in the draft from the window. Outside on Market Street, Philadelphia continued its ordinary evening, the way cities do, indifferent to the enormity of what has just ended, carrying the weight of it forward without knowing quite what they are carrying. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.